Part 3, Creating CGI Scripts. Now, as we've already seen, the HTML form tag specifies the script that should be run in the action equals attribute. Now, CGI scripts live in a specific directory, typically var www CGI bin or home httpd CGI bin, but the web server can be configured to allow CGI scripts to live in the same directory as your HTML pages or anywhere else. And as I said earlier, when it comes to creating web pages and creating CGI scripts at Birkbeck, there's a special location and you will be told about that in the practical. A CGI script must extract data sent with get or post methods. And this actually involves quite complex unpacking and decoding of the information. But in Python, that's all handled by using the CGI module, so just putting import CGI into your script. So what we need to do initially is read in the form, read in all the data that were in the form. And that's achieved simply by doing form equals CGI.field storage. And then we can access the fields using either the value equals form, square brackets, and the key dot value. Now the key is the name that you used within the form. Or we can say value equals form dot get value and the name that's used in the form. So we can either use this kind of dictionary approach or a function approach, whichever you prefer. Now the first thing that we need when we send a page back to a web browser is to tell the web browser what the data are that are going to follow. And normally this will be an HTML web page. We need to tell it that by giving it a header line that specifies the content type. So for HTML, this is text/HTML. So we simply say print content type : text/HTML, and that needs to be followed by a blank line. So we can do that two ways. We can either print two separate lines like this, or we can just do the print content type and then put a \n, which will create a blank line, an extra blank line after the printed content. So as I said, this tells the web browser what sort of data are being delivered, and there are other types that we could specify. It could be plain text, it could be a file that needs to be saved, it could be an image, audio, and so on. So this is the simple CGI script that we saw previously. All it does is prints the content type and then prints some HTML. So this actually isn't accessing anything from a form, but it is generating an HTML page. So you could go straight to where this CGI script lives, you could enter that as the URL, and that would then just print a normal HTML web page for you. So we weren't using the CGI module there at all because we were just printing HTML. We didn't need to access anything from a form. Now here's a slightly more complicated example where we are accessing something from a form. So we're assuming that the web page had a form that contained some value ID. So it said name equals ID in one of the form elements. So this really looks exactly the same as the previous example, except that I've added 4 lines. I've added the import CGI. I've done a form equals CGI.field storage to parse the information that was entered into the form. And then I've done a value equals form.getValue and ID, because that was the name that we're assuming was used in the form to label this piece of data. And then in the print statements is exactly the same sort of thing we had before, except that I've got paragraph ID parameter was, and then the value that I obtained up here, and ending the paragraph. And in this particular example, rather than just doing one long print statement for everything, I've constructed a variable called HTML, which starts with the HTML tag and gradually adds the other bits of information, including the parameter, and then just prints it all at the end. Normally, only one value is returned for each form element. So when you have a name equals something, you would just associate that with a single value. So you use a different name equals attribute for each item, just as you would use a different variable to refer to a different piece of data in a normal script. However, things like the selection list, so you saw the pull-down menu and then the associated sort of scrolling list, can return multiple name value pairs for the same name. And in that case, we use form.getList. Here's an example. All I'm doing now is I'm saying values equals form.getListID. So if this were one of these multiple selection lists in the web page, this would return an array or list of values, and then all I've done here is go through those values and added them as a list item. So in the HTML here, I put an unordered list, and I've gone through the values and added an HTML thing which gives me a list item plus the value plus ending the list item, and then printed that in the same way. Now, one of the things that you very often need to do from a CGI script is to access and run some other program. Now, there are various ways of doing this from within a Python script, and to my mind none of them is really simple and ideal. Just for comparison, in Perl all you need to do is say return value equals, and you put a command that you want to run and the arguments that you want to give to the program in backticks. So let's see how we have to approach this in Python. Now, there are different ways of doing it. One is to import the subprocess module, and then we can say result equals subprocess.checkOutput, and then we give the program name and any arguments that it needs, and add shell equals true. The result comes back as an encoded string, and we need to decode that using result equals str, the current version of result, and specify UTF-8. So this is what you do generally when you need the actual output from the program. In some cases you might not need the output, you might be just logging some information, for example, into something else like a relational database. So when you don't need the output, then we have other ways of doing this. So one of them is to do import OS, and then we can just say os.system and pass it the command and the arguments. So this is quite useful. It can be used for shell commands, and we can use the greater than sign to redirect the output to some other temporary file if we needed to get the output from that. But the limitations of this are, first of all, that you have to escape any special characters in this string that you're passing, and it's actually now deprecated. It's not the recommended way of doing this anymore. The recommended way of doing it now is, as shown here, that we import the subprocess module and we do subprocess.call, and we then give it a string with the command and the arguments and shell equals true. Alternatively, we can do subprocess.call and then we give it a list which starts with the first command or the name of the command that we wish to run, and then we give it an argument, and we carry on that list with any arguments, any other arguments that need to be passed. This provides lots of flexibility and is now the recommended way to do it. On the other hand, when you do need the output, things become a little bit different. The first of these approaches is to use popen. Now what popen does is to open what's known as a pipe. You may be familiar with pipes as the kind of vertical bar that you can use from the command line to send the output of one program to the input of another. And this is similar, except that we're having a program running and we're opening access to write to another program which can then send results back to us. So in this case we call os.popen, we pass it the command and arguments, and what comes back, this stream, is actually a file handle that can be handled in exactly the normal way in order to read the results back from running this program. Now another way of doing it is again using subprocess, but this time because we're interested in what comes back, we use subprocess.check_output. We pass it the command and arguments and shell equals true, or as we saw on the last slide, we pass it a list with the command followed by various arguments. Now we have to convert from a byte string into standard text, which we do using this str command, and this provides us again with lots of flexibility. It's the recommended way to do it, but it's only supported in versions of Python greater than 2.7. Now that's not really a problem for you since you're all learning to use version 3 of Python, but it's just something to be aware of. There is another way of doing it which is much simpler. We just import commands and we say status and return value equals commands.getStatusOutput command arguments. It's very simple, but it's only supported on Unix and it's deprecated in Python 3. Just summarizing those then, the recommended way to do things is to use the subprocess module, and we do subprocess.call when you don't need the output and subprocess.checkoutput when you do need the output. Now, if you're doing this and accessing external programs, you do need to remember that CGI scripts and the programs that they will spawn as a result of doing this run as a special user, sometimes called nobody, sometimes called Apache, and therefore the search path and the environment variables may not be what you expect. So if you run your CGI script that you're writing by hand, the environment that that runs in may be quite different from how it runs when it's run from within the web server. Similarly, things like access to data, things may be protected and you may be able to see your own data files, but the web user can't. So you need to make sure that all these things are addressed. So environment variables are things that are used by programs, often for configuration purposes, for example specifying where data files live. So normally you might set those in your bashrc or tcshrc or zshrc, whatever shell you're using. You would set those in there with something simple like export variable name equals value, or setenv variable name value. Now in the case of a CGI script, you're probably going to have to set that within the CGI script itself, and we do that by importing the OS module and then saying os.environ and the name, the variable name, the environment variable name, and setting it equal to a value. Similarly, if you are accessing external programs, then it's generally a good idea to specify the full path to that program rather than just calling it by name, with the possible exception of standard Unix-like commands like mkdir for creating a directory, or rm for removing a file, and so on. We often need to create temporary working files. And one of the problems here is that you have to remember that several people could be accessing your web server at the same time, and therefore you must ensure that any temporary files you create have unique file names. One way of doing that is to ensure that the process ID is appended to the file name. Now, every process that you have running, every command that you run, every program that you write and then you run will have its own unique process ID while the program is running. And what you can do then is import the OS module and then construct a file name which contains os.getPID. The os.getPID obtains the process ID for the currently running process. You may also need to create temporary HTML files to return to the user. So rather than creating a web page on the fly, you might want to create a web page somewhere that then is accessed by the user. That's particularly useful when you need to include images. So you might want to be plotting a graph, for example, as part of what you're doing on the web server. That graph would need to live somewhere and then be accessed from the HTML that you return. So the graph would typically be a GIF or a PNG file, something like that, and you could then put that into a temporary directory which can be accessed by your HTML page. So most web servers are set up to provide a temporary directory in which such files can be written, and often there will be a background job running somewhere that will delete those after a week or so. In summary then, we have looked at how forms are used to send data to a web server. We've talked about the get and post methods for transferring data, get being used for relatively small amounts of data and post for larger amounts of data. The advantage of get is that it actually is a way of transferring data using a normal URL, and that means that you can also send data to a web server just by having a link which contains a complex URL with a question mark, key equals value, ampersand key equals value, and so on. So that can be quite useful for generating pages of results, for example, from a database search, and then providing links that query the database again and get some more detailed information about the results that you've got. CGI scripts can simply serve web pages. We don't obtain any data from a form or anything like that. We don't need to use the CGI module. We're just printing data. But more frequently they're used to obtain data from a page and perhaps run external programs and then send the results back basically by just printing them as a set of HTML. So we've talked about the way that we construct forms in HTML, and we've talked about the key requirements of CGI scripts, which are really just to import the CGI module, to obtain the data from the form, and then to print back the results using first of all the content type header and then just printing HTML with the results of whatever calculations we're doing.